My name is Naomi Goldberg, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Camille Karabayich and Suzanne Agerbach, and we're from the Disability Rights Unit at the Massachusetts Office on Disability. Going forward, I'm going to be using the acronym MOD to refer to Mass Office on Disability. So for those of you who are less familiar with MOD, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We're a very small state agency that serves as a resource for state agencies, municipalities, members of the public by providing information, guidance, and training on matters concerning disability-related civil rights and architectural access. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Disability Rights Unit, or DRU, is Suzanne, Camille, and I. And DRU is usually the first point of contact when someone contacts the agency with a question or concern. And our function and focus is to explain how disability rights laws apply in various settings, including housing, employment, state and local government, higher education, and in places that are open to the public. And we provide a lot of guidance on how to properly request reasonable accommodation and modifications, and to navigate communication around making these requests. So we offer a lot of practical suggestions for negotiating solutions, and then we also inform people about their recourse options. Okay, so the objective of today's workshop is really to provide you with a better understanding of what reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification means in a housing setting. And this includes understanding a housing provider's obligations to provide a reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification, and when they're allowed to deny a request. We're going to discuss how these requests should be evaluated and what medical information should be provided to support a request. We'll also discuss what a good request looks like, what options a resident has when a housing provider doesn't agree to provide the accommodation or modification that they've requested. And we decided to create this workshop because we spend a lot of time speaking to people about this topic. And while we find that people seem to know the term reasonable accommodation, and they know it's something that people with disabilities can request in housing, we find that people are a little bit less familiar with the finer details. And this subject, could be very straightforward, but most of the time it really isn't. So we created this workshop with the goal of speaking to the particular things that people are often confused about. And we hope that by the end, you'll feel a little bit more confident with your knowledge of this subject. Okay, definitions. So reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification are often used interchangeably. They're really similar concepts in that they're both something that is needed to ensure that a person with a disability can equally enjoy their housing. A reasonable accommodation is a change or an exception or an adjustment to a rule, a policy, a practice, or a service, while a reasonable modification is a structural change that is made to the premises. So a person who needs either one of these in housing is really just asking that their housing provider grant a request to them. And in doing so, they are explaining that there's a connection between their disability-related limitations and their need for the reasonable accommodation or modification that they're requesting. And we are really going to discuss this at length going forward. So welcome. So some examples. So there's no exhaustive list of what is a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification, but here's some common examples. The reasonable modification examples we have here are structural changes, installing a grab bar in a bathroom, widening doorways so that there's sufficient clearance for a person using a mobility device to get through a door. The RA examples that we have here are about changing policies or changing the way that things are done. So we have an example of assigning a parking space to an individual in their housing development when ordinarily the parking is not assigned and it's only available typically on a first come, first served basis. And the person making the request needs it because usually they can't find accessible parking using this method. The other example we have here is implementing a fragrance-free policy in common areas for a resident with a chemical sensitivity who otherwise wouldn't be able to utilize any of the amenities offered in housing, if they're not able to to use them because of, excessive fragrance. Now, modifying a no pets policy to allow a service animal or emotional support animal is a really common reasonable accommodation request. But since there are some very specific rules around evaluating this type of request that are different than the typical evaluation that you do for a reasonable accommodation in housing, we're not going to discuss the topic today because it would take a lot of time. And we're sorry about that, but we've included a link here to one of our guidance documents on the subject that we think will answer a lot of your questions. But we welcome you to contact us with your questions on this subject. And we're going to have a slide at the end of the PowerPoint that has that contact information. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so who can make a request for accommodation or modification? So today, while we're offering some tips and recommendations for how to make an effective request, you should know that there isn't a requirement that these requests be made in a specific way or that specific words be used in a request. That said, you'll find as we move along through this presentation, we're going to offer some best practice type suggestions that we think will help people better communicate their needs and better navigate these kinds of discussions with their housing provider. Okay, so it is residents with disabilities who would make the request for a reasonable accommodation or modification if they encounter barriers in their housing due to their disability-related limitations. And by a person with a disability, we're referring to an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So additionally, in order to be eligible to make a request, the person with a disability has to live in housing that's covered by fair housing laws. We're going to talk about those in a second. But between the state and federal laws, most housing is covered. So one type of housing that isn't covered would be a two-family unit or two-family housing where the landlord lives in one of the units, like a two-family building, a two-family or two apartments in a building. So while we're always going to recommend that if a resident with a disability is capable of doing so, that they are the one who makes the request for reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification, that they make the request to their housing provider for themselves. And this is because the person with the disability knows the most about their limitations and how they're impacted in their specific housing setting and can best describe their needs to the housing provider. But that said, it's also fine for a third party like a friend, a family member, or even a healthcare provider to make the request on the resident's behalf. And also, while it's definitely allowed to make the request verbally, that should be considered a request. We're always going to recommend that the request be done in writing if you can do that. And we're going to get into this detail a lot later. All right, now let's get to the laws. Our focus today is on the fair housing laws. That's what applies in housing. It's not ADA really. It's the Federal Fair Housing Act and Mass General Laws, Chapter 151B. And both of these laws prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in housing, and they obligate housing providers to make reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. We've also included Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act here because it's another anti-discrimination law that applies to any entity that receives federal funds, including housing developments. And we've mentioned this law simply because it would be an additional anti-discrimination law that it would apply if a housing development is federally funded, but we're not going to discuss it beyond that since the fair housing laws sufficiently cover those properties anyway. And on this slide, we've also noted that there are other laws, regulations, and codes that may apply in certain housing settings, and we are referencing them here because we want to point out that reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification is not applicable to every situation or barrier that a person with a disability experiences in housing, and some issues have to be addressed in other ways. So one thing is tenants' rights laws. They talk about a housing provider's obligations to provide safe and sanitary housing, to do repairs, to follow certain eviction procedures. We have the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board regulations that prescribe that certain access features be present in multiple dwelling housing, depending on when the building was built or when it was substantially renovated. There are also fire codes and building codes that housing providers also have to follow. So as we move forward with the presentation, you're going to hear more about how these other laws, regulations, codes sometimes intersect with an issue that a person is experiencing around a reasonable accommodation or modification. Okay, so who do these housing laws that we just referenced apply to? When we talk about making the reasonable accommodation or modification requests, we're referring to housing providers who are the ones responsible for receiving the requests and granting them if they're reasonable. And housing providers include privately owned companies, small landlords, except the two-family housing where the owner lives in the unit, as I mentioned before. Condo or homeowners associations are housing providers, as are subsidized housing providers, which could include housing authorities or privately managed subsidized housing developments. Okay, so a little bit more on the housing provider's obligations. First, and this is the real obvious piece, housing providers are prohibited from treating residents differently because they have disabilities. That's really the basic definition of discrimination, treating someone differently because they are in a protected class, such as disability. That's what the definition of discrimination is generally, but it is also considered discriminatory in the case of people with disabilities to deny an accommodation or modification that is considered reasonable. It's also be considered discriminatory to ignore a request for reasonable accommodation or modification, to deny a prospective tenant because they've requested such, to evict or otherwise penalize a resident for requesting an accommodation or modification, or to pass the costs on of providing a reasonable accommodation to the resident. I just want to note that with reasonable modification, there are some instances in which a resident is responsible for financing a reasonable modification. And we're going to get to those particulars later. I just want to mention that. Next slide. Okay. What things must a housing provider consider when they receive a request? They are obligated to accept and consider every reasonable accommodation or modification request that they get and evaluate it on a case-by-case basis in consideration of the particulars of the situation. There are no blanket rules. You're supposed to look at every situation individually and evaluate. It's also very important to note that a housing provider's obligation is to provide an accommodation or modification that is effective. And this may mean that they don't offer exactly what you've requested. If the alternative offer is effective, meaning it will eliminate the barrier you've described, they've met their obligations. So for example, let's say that I've acquired a mobility disability. I can no longer use the stairs at my building entrance. I asked my housing provider to install a ramp as a reasonable modification. They evaluate my request and they offer as an alternative to transfer me to a building with a barrier-free entrance within 3 months. While this is not my preference to move, it may be considered to be an effective alternative as an accommodation because they've eliminated the barrier and they can do it relatively quickly. And here we're going to get to a very important point, but don't worry, we're going to repeat it 100 times today throughout the presentation. There are instances in which a housing provider can legitimately deny a request for reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification, even if you can prove you need it. And so a request would be considered unreasonable if granting it would result in an undue financial administrative burden, if it would result in a fundamental alteration to the business, it would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others. If the person didn't provide enough information to show that the accommodation or modification is necessary, or if there's some other law, code, or rule that interferes with the housing provider's ability to grant the request. Now I'm going to turn this over to Camille. Thank you.
Good evening. So the reasonable accommodation and modification request process is generally very simple, but we've broken it down into 8 steps so we can highlight areas where individuals sometimes get stuck. Yeah, so we'll get started with step one, which is defining the problem. So if you're coming to the accommodation or modification process, it's because you're having some problem or difficulty with your housing. We recommend thinking about your problem and defining it as these three parts to make it super clear to your housing provider what the issue is and why the issue is disability related. So the obstacle is the specific challenge you are facing with the current housing policy or structure. The limitations are your functional limitations or symptoms that explain your need for the accommodation. Remember that you don't have to include any symptoms that aren't directly related to what you're asking for. And the link, which is sometimes called the nexus, is the connection between the obstacle and those limitations. This part is really important and it's an area people often miss. So don't make the mistake of assuming that your housing provider will just understand your need because you say you have a disability or even that you have a specific limitation. Housing providers are not experts in disabilities, and different people can have very different lived experiences with the same disability. So you really want to define the link, even if it feels a little bit simple or repetitive. So we have an example here. I have difficulty using the front door, the obstacle, because I have muscle atrophy in my arms, which causes muscle weakness and pain, the limitations. The door is too heavy for me to pull open, which links the obstacle and those limitations. All right, so we're already done with step one. We like to call step two your navigation step. This is essentially your step to ensure that an accommodation and modification request process is the right process for you and to start the very basic preparation if so. So first you want to consider if you're eligible to make an accommodation or modification request. And this starts by ensuring that your housing is covered. So like Naomi was talking about earlier, in Massachusetts, all housing is covered except two-family owner occupied, meaning there's only 2 apartment units and your landlord lives in one and you rent the other one. If your housing is covered, you next consider if you are covered by asking, do I have a disability related need for this request? And if yes, then you're eligible to make the accommodation or modification request. Your next consideration is this issue best handled as an accommodation or modification request or as something else? So I want to emphasize that just because an issue cannot be addressed through the accommodation or modification request process, that does not mean that it isn't important or that it doesn't impact you differently because of your disability. It just means that there's a different avenue to resolve the issue. So asking this question is really important because it saves you time and energy of making a request in the wrong place, and because some resolutions are faster process than the accommodation modification process. So you want to just resolve things as quickly as possible. There are several categories your issue could fall under. One guiding question that can help you pin down if something is an accommodation issue is, would this be an issue even if the individual didn't have a disability? If the answer is yes, the issue is probably handled through a different avenue. Another similar question you can try is there already a non-disability related avenue to address this? And again, if the answer is yes, it is not likely to be handled as an accommodation or modification. So what are some other common topics your housing could fall under other than an accommodation or modification? It could be a physical access code violation, a lease or condo doc violation, a health and sanitation violation, or it could be something that just is otherwise illegal or an issue for law enforcement. Do note that in some situations you might start with a code or trying to enforce these terms, and if you still have needs after those basic requirements are met, then you might request an accommodation or modification. So an example of that is if railings in a shared stairwell are too low for you to reach them, you can start by checking the access codes to see if the railings were installed at the proper height. If they are at the proper height, but they don't meet your needs, then you could make a modification request to have them be moved to a taller height. So we're going to do a few examples together. Each of these categories will be used only once, and the list from this slide is in part 1 of your handout, so you can refer back to the categories. All right, so for this first set of examples, I'd like you to give me a thumbs up symbol in your reactions if you think, yes, this would be an issue even if the individual didn't have a disability. And you can give me the crying, laughing symbol if no, it is only an issue due to their disability. So the first one is Shreyas has a roach infestation that is aggravating his asthma symptoms. What do we think? Thumbs up or crying, laughing? I'm seeing a mix of the two. So in this case, we would say yes, that roach infestations are an issue no matter if somebody has a disability or not, even though it does seem to impact Shreyas a little bit differently due to his disability. This is a tenants' rights, health, and sanitation issue. So next we have Micah, who has a sensory disability and their neighbors are constantly making noise. So again, thumbs up if you think this would be an issue, even if they didn't have a disability, and crying if you think it's only disability related. All right, yeah, thanks everyone for voting. I'm seeing more thumbs up here, and that's correct. This noise issues are like lease violation issues. But as we mentioned on the last slide, if Micah was still having difficulty after enforcing like quiet hours and those types of lease terms, then they could still make an accommodation request to make sure that their needs are met. So they might be able to get sound machine or something like that. Number 3, Maya's neighbor is stealing her mail and it's impacting her anxiety. Yeah, so this one here, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up again. This is otherwise illegal. No one's allowed to steal mail. So even though it impacts her differently because of her disability, it has another avenue to be handled. This next one's a little bit tricky. The ramp outside of Ramona's building is too steep. What do we think about this one? Yeah, big mix here, but the thumbs up do have it on this one. So physical access codes apply across the board. So whether somebody had a disability or not, a ramp would have to meet a certain slope. But certainly if the ramp already meets the correct slope and it still doesn't meet Ramona's needs, then she could make a modification request. Finally, we have Opal, who's a wheelchair user and needs a roll-in shower. Yeah, so this one is going to be the crying, laughing emoji. So this one is specific to Opal's disability. It wouldn't be needed otherwise. So that is going to be a modification request. So these examples show that even though an issue impacts someone with a disability differently, it doesn't mean that the accommodation or modification process is necessarily going to be the right process for them to resolve their issue. So your next navigation step, if you've decided that an accommodation or modification is your best option, your last prep work to do is to find the policy that you're asking for a change or exception to if it's an accommodation. So you might look to your lease or condo docs, or if there's no written policy, ask yourself what seems to be the practice. If it's a modification request, you're unlikely to have a policy that you're looking at since you're looking at physical structural changes. But if you live in a condo or have an HOA, you might want to look at what's considered common space versus personal space. And then you might want to think in advance about who's going to cover the cost of this change. So if it's an accommodation, your housing provider is always going to pay. If it's a modification, it depends. So we'll look at that in more detail on the next slide. So there are different rules about who pays for a modification for different types of housing. So if it is public, government subsidized project-based housing, so housing authority housing, the housing provider will pay as long as the request is otherwise reasonable. And again, this is for modifications. Do note that mobile vouchers are going to follow the private rules because you have a private housing provider. In private housing, the federal law does not require housing providers to pay for modifications, but the Massachusetts law does require housing providers to pay for modifications if there are 10 or more units and the request is otherwise reasonable. So now that we're prepared to make an accommodation or modification request, let's pass to Suzanne to discuss considering our solutions.
So we've gotten clear on what obstacle you're facing and whether a reasonable accommodation or modification is an appropriate avenue. The next step is to consider solutions to overcome the obstacle. There are three parts of the consider solution step. You're going to brainstorm ideas and maybe do a bit of research if you need to. Then you're going to evaluate which solution is most effective and reasonable. And lastly, while legally you don't have to address any concerns the housing provider has, thinking about this can help you tweak and phrase your request in a way that nurtures that relationship and makes the process go more smoothly. Note that you don't have to have worked out an exact solution to make a request, but your housing provider may have little idea what would be effective or what sorts of details might affect you. Think of the housing provider as the expert on their business and on the building, and you are the expert on your disability, informing them on what would and wouldn't work for you. You may need to collaborate to work out a solution, but it makes sense for you to indicate at least what sort of thing would work for you to help ensure that you get a solution that works and that will last. So firstly, brainstorming. Start by identifying any obvious solution. Often this will end up being what you request, but it's a good idea to then think back to the obstacle and limitations you've identified and brainstorm other possible solutions. You might research how other people have solved this sort of obstacle. You might get ideas from an internet research or from asking a contractor or an expert about possible solutions. Let's look at an example. Say I have a disability that is making it hard to get through the front door to my building. One obvious solution is one of those automatic door openers where you push a big button and the door opens for you. These aren't required under code, so you'd be making a modification request, but they can be pretty expensive. An undue financial burden is a valid reason for the landlord to deny the request. So it's a good idea to explore other solutions that would work for me and that could be a whole lot easier to get approved. Here we can see how helpful it is if you've gotten specific about the limitations you have and what obstacle you're facing. If I have decreased arm strength that makes the door too heavy to push open, then simply adjusting the pressure of the door hinge might be an easy and effective fix. If I use mobility equipment that is bulky or I'm a slow walker, perhaps the door is closing too fast and banging into me. Then installing a slow close hinge could be all I need. If I have limited grip in my fingers, then a round doorknob may be hard for me to turn, but a lever could work fine. Or finally, if I can't turn my wrist easily, then I might be struggling with turning a key in the lock. A change to a key fob or card might remove that obstacle. So there will be times where an automatic door opener is the best or only solution, but you can see that depending on the specifics, there can be alternative solutions that will be effective and are likely to be much easier to get approved. Once you've brainstormed possible solutions, the next step is to evaluate them. You're going to want to think each solution through in detail to make sure it will actually resolve your issue. And you want to check that you're not wasting your time asking for something that isn't going to be considered reasonable. Often as you think through the specifics of using the solution, you realize that there are additional details you need to specify or tweaks you need to make. For example, Say I have a mobility disability, which means I can't usually walk more than 100 yards. So I'm planning on asking for an assigned parking spot within 100 yards of my door. But what about when I'm carrying my weekly grocery shop? Is 100 yards then too much of a stretch? If I use a rollator, do I need to have a route that has a curb cut to get up onto the sidewalk? Does there need to be a sign above my parking spot so that people can see that it's reserved even when there is snow on the ground? We can see that just by mentally rehearsing using a solution and thinking about what complications may arise, we can evaluate if it's going to be effective and make useful tweaks to our request. Now, let's give you an example to practice doing that evaluation. Sam has lived in his apartment for 3 years. He has a sensory processing condition that makes him very sensitive to noise. 4 months ago, new neighbours moved into the upstairs apartment. They have a colicky infant who cries at all hours of the night, and 2 older children who like to run laps around the house. In addition, they play music and TV really loud. So Sam has brainstormed and come up with some solutions that he's going to evaluate. He could talk to his neighbours or to his landlord about reducing the noise. That's a tenants' rights approach. He could request a reasonable accommodation for a white noise machine. He could make an RA request for installation of soundproofing, or he could make a request to be transferred to another unit. Put yourself in Sam's shoes and consider how likely each of these ideas is to actually resolve his issue, both in the immediate and the longer term. You can share your thoughts in the chat. Any thoughts? Okay, well, let me go through these. Talking to the neighbours can be a great place to start because it's pretty easy and it may help, but it's unlikely to eliminate noises like the crying baby. Soundproofing depends on the building structure, so it's a bit hard for him to work out how effective that's really going to be. A white noise machine might work, but he may not want to have that switched on all the time and always have white noise going on. So maybe he thinks about asking for some of those, asking for white noise and talking to the neighbours as short-term improvements. But for an effective long-term solution, he thinks about asking for a transfer to another one of the landlord's properties. But is this going to solve his issue? The new unit is also going to have neighbours, and neighbours change over time. So how can he make it more likely to be effective? He might want to ask for a top floor unit because noise often comes down from above more than from other directions. But the landlord has no obligation to make someone else move out, so he'll have to wait until a suitable unit becomes free. If he adds further restrictions like not facing a road or not being near an elevator, then it's likely to take even longer for a matching unit to become available. So our aim is to evaluate how effective each of those solutions is going to be and get specific about the aspects that are important to make that solution effective for you, while staying flexible about aspects that really don't matter so much. You can see that sometimes it might make sense to take a combination of approaches or try an easy solution first before moving on to something that is more demanding. So once you have one or more solutions that would be effective, you want to evaluate whether they would be considered reasonable, so you don't waste your time on a request that the housing provider is likely to deny. There are several specific reasons that allow a housing provider to deny a request. These are aspects that would make the request unreasonable. The first reason is undue financial or administrative burden. The housing provider doesn't have to provide something that will cost too much money or time. What is considered undue burden will depend on the housing provider's budget and staffing. So an expensive auto door opener might be undue burden for a condo association of a 12-unit building that's just spent almost all their money on a new roof. And even in a really big building, asking for someone to bring your mail to you each day is a lot to ask if the building doesn't actually have any on-site staff. Next, a fundamental alteration to their business means you're asking the housing provider to provide a new service or fundamentally change how they operate. For example, say I live in a retirement community that provides scheduled outings by bus, and I ask them to take me to medical appointments. That would be a completely different service and a fundamental alteration that they don't need to agree to. For direct threat to the health or safety of others, it's important to note this isn't talking about fear of stereotypes or vague hypotheticals. It's where there's good reason to believe the request could cause significant harm to people or property. For example, if you're asking to leave food or trash in the hallway, it's very likely to attract pests and become a health issue unless it's properly sealed. Lastly is the most basic one. If you do not have a disability or you're not facing an obstacle to equal use and enjoyment of your housing, or your stated need for your request has no connection to your disability, or what you're requesting doesn't actually solve the obstacle, then they don't have to agree to your request. Of course, this isn't going to happen if you follow our steps, because you will have clearly identified and communicated all these things in your request. But even if they don't think you have a disability-related need, they should still give you a chance to clarify. That's part of the interactive process that we'll discuss later on. So these are the reasons a request can be unreasonable. There are a few other possible barriers like regulations the housing provider isn't allowed to break. So a few of these are access codes. We talked about the architectural access codes. For example, you can't add a ramp if there's not enough room to do it, because then it would be breaking the code by being too steep. If it's not actually possible, like adding an elevator to a building that hasn't been built with that possibility in mind, fire codes, if I wanted to leave my scooter in the hallway and this would block the escape route, that would break the fire code. There are also health and safety codes, zoning laws that may be in conflict with what you're asking. So just be aware of that. So let's practice evaluating whether a request is reasonable. Let's look at some requests about communication. You can use Zoom reactions to indicate your answers. Give me a thumbs up if you think the example is going to be considered reasonable, and a crying or surprised face if you think it's going to be unreasonable. So the first one, Benjamina has PTSD. She has asked for maintenance to give 24 hours notice in advance of coming, to knock and announce themselves, and if nobody answers, not to enter. do we think that that is reasonable? We've got lots of thumbs up. Yes, so that's probably reasonable, except for emergencies. If her bath is overflowing and flooding downstairs, they may need to, come in and make very sure that she knows that they're coming in. The next one. I get a lot of anxiety when I have to wait for a call back. I want you to always answer the phone when I call. Is that going to be reasonable? Yes. So we have lots of faces there. So we agree that is unlikely to be reasonable because it's likely to be undue administrative burden. They are unlikely to have staff available always to answer the phone. 3. Angela is deaf. She can read written English and is fluent in ASL. She got a lease violation notice for which she's being reprimanded and will have to meet with the property manager. She's requested an ASL interpreter for this meeting. What do we think? Is that reasonable? Yeah, and one of the big parts of that is because it's a really important meeting. It's really important that she can understand the very specific nuanced detail that they might be talking about and how they agree to figure that out. Number 4, the property manager has a vendetta against me, so I always want to speak to someone else. Is that likely to be reasonable? We have a little mix, but mostly faces there. So I would agree, probably unreasonable. They haven't shown any disability-related need, and it's also unlikely that they're going to have the staffing to be able to always guarantee that. Lastly, I don't understand my recertification documents because of my learning disability. Can I meet with somebody to discuss the terms before I sign them? Reasonable or not? Getting lots of thumbs up there. So yes, generally that would be considered reasonable for important documents. Great. Let's quickly look at the last part of considering our solutions, the housing provider concerns. Note that you're not obligated to consider or solve your housing provider's concerns. A common one is cost, but unless it reaches the level of undue burden, it's not a reason they're allowed to deny your request. But it is common for housing providers to have concerns that can lead them to push back on your request or get resentful about it, which is nice to avoid if you can. So from a practical perspective, it's useful to consider. What are some common concerns landlords and condo boards tend to have? That it's going to be expensive, time consuming, that it might cause other tenants to react or flood them with similar requests, that it might have an effect on whether they can meet other codes, change their insurance costs, and be considered a good landlord to the other residents. They may also think about, is this going to cause difficulties later on? So identifying these concerns, you can look at your request and decide if you want to tweak it to address a likely concern, preempt resentment by reminding them of their obligations or by being appreciative, or offer suggestions to address their concerns. For example, you might be concerned what to say to other residents who notice my accommodation and ask about it, as you shouldn't be sharing the confidential information about my disability. Here is what I'd be happy for you to say about it. Da 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 da. So that gives you an idea about addressing provider concerns. We're about halfway through now, so let's take a 5-minute break. It is 6:18, so let's come back at 6:23. Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So in the first half, we defined the problem we are facing, worked out whether an accommodation or modification was an appropriate avenue to resolve our issue, and worked out what reasonable solution to ask for. So now we're ready to draft the wording of the actual letter. So first, I want to highlight again that drafting a reasonable accommodation or modification is usually very simple. It's generally a few sentences, maybe a couple of paragraphs, but the wording can be really important. So we're going into a lot of detail to help you feel confident that those few sentences include all of the right information. Second, you are allowed to make an accommodation or modification request verbally, but there are many reasons that it's going to be helpful to both you and your housing provider to have this in writing. So we always recommend submitting your request either by email or letter. And it's also a good idea to keep a copy of your request. Also note that some housing providers have an accommodation or modification request form that they'll ask you to complete. You aren't required to use the form instead of a letter, but using it can sometimes make the process more efficient because they're used to processing their own forms. These forms should just be a set of questions prompting you to give the exact same information as you would provide in a letter or email. But note that if they ask anything that isn't okay, you can always skip that question. So there is no set legal requirement for how you have to write this request, but your housing provider must be able to determine that you have a disability and a disability-related need to be able to approve your request. So to show that, we recommend that you identify yourself as a person with a disability. Remember that you don't have to disclose your medical diagnosis if you don't feel comfortable doing so. To describe your functional limitations or symptoms that are related to the request. To describe the current challenge that you're having in the housing. To describe the link between the obstacle and the limitations. To provide a specific description of what you're asking for as an accommodation or modification. You can also choose to mention that you're making your accommodation or modification request under fair housing laws and borrow language from that, that providing this change will help you equally use, enjoy, or access your housing. And it's also helpful to request an initial response by a specific date. That's usually about 2 weeks out. So let's do a practice together. The list of suggested language from the last slide is in part 2 of your handout if you want to refer to it. So here we have Jane, who has drafted this reasonable modification request, and we're going to work together to make it stronger. It says, landlord, I have a disability. I need a new stove because mine doesn't work for me. I can't cook for myself and I'm losing weight and that's bad for my health. How quickly can you do this? Jane. So following the order in the handout, and again, you can use the thumbs up for yes, and any of the other emojis to mean no. So has Jane described that she has a disability? I'm seeing some no's here. So she has stated that she has a disability. Remember that she doesn't have to include her diagnosis if she doesn't want to. So this actually is fine. But the next question, does she include a good description of the functional limitations? Yes or no? I would agree with the emojis here that no, she hasn't really specified those, and she could definitely clarify that. So here, she could add something like, my condition causes stiffness in my hands, muscle spasms in my hands, I have trouble grasping, and I can't turn my wrist well, and that's a lot clearer. So what about the obstacle and link between the obstacle and limitations? Yeah, I'm seeing some no's. I think it could be clearer as well. She says she needs the stove or that she needs her stove doesn't currently work for her, which is an obstacle, but she doesn't say why. So adding something like, I need a new stove because I cannot turn the knobs on my stove. I currently can't use the stove at all is much clearer. Has she specified what accommodation she's asking for? I'm getting some yeses, some nos. So she has said that she's requesting a new stove, but this is an important point here. Is that if the landlord just picked a new stove, it's not clear that they would pick one that would suit her needs. So it would be very helpful for her to clarify the type of stove she's looking for by saying something like, I'm looking for a stove with push buttons. So that would be clarifying, so that she doesn't get another one with knobs or some other feature that doesn't work. So does she include that she is making her accommodation or modification request under fair housing laws? She hasn't mentioned it here. It's optional. So she doesn't have to, but if she wanted to add it, we think it fits nicely right at the beginning of the request, saying something like, I'm making a reasonable modification request under fair housing laws. So very simple there. And what about a timeline for response? Has she included any of that? Looks like she has said, how quickly can you do this? But that's not very clear. As far as, getting a response, it might take time to actually implement it, even if it was approved, right? So just for an initial response, it would be helpful to say something like, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will expect a response by May 4th. And this is just a note to remember your basics. If it's a letter, add a date at the top. Your landlord may have multiple properties, so it might be helpful to put your address in the request, those types of simple things. So let's move on. Now that we've walked through an example together, I wanted to give you an opportunity to practice on your own. So here's your scenario. Tia is a 57-year-old living in Cape Cod. She has COPD, asthma, and depression. COPD is a lung condition that causes shortness of breath, fluid buildup in her legs and ankles, both of which make walking more challenging and uncomfortable. Tia's condo association has first come, first served parking. Tia works 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and when she comes home, she generally ends up with a parking space all the way on the left side of the parking lot when her unit is all the way on the right side. She wants an assigned parking space. So you can reference part 3 of your handout for assistance, but let's take just 3 or 4 minutes to draft a request for Tia independently, and then we will go through some review questions together so that you can look at what you've done and see if there are any details that you still wanted to add. So we'll come back at 6:33. All right. I know that was quick, but thank you everyone for taking the time to practice. We're not going to make anyone read their request aloud or type it all in the chat, but I'll run through some questions so you can review what you've written independently. And if you have any notes on the example, you can feel free to throw them in the chat. So some things to think about are, did you include that she meets the definition of having a disability? Remember with that point, you can say, she can say that she has COPD if she wants to, but she doesn't have to disclose her diagnosis if she doesn't feel comfortable doing so. So just saying she meets the definition is fine. When describing her conditions, did you exclude depression since that's not relevant to this request? Did you explain what is challenging about the current parking policy? I might say something like the first come, first served parking policy means I always have to park at the far end of the lot. Another question to consider, did you explain that she's asking for an assigned space as close as possible to her unit? This one is a pretty important feature, so you want to make sure you include all of the features she needs in a parking space. Here, it seems like she's only looking to be as close as possible to her unit, but it could very well be that someone needs an extra wide parking space so they can fully open their door, need a curb cut, they need an access aisle, something like that. So you want to be really clear what you mean when you're asking for an assigned parking space. Did you include what laws she's requesting under? This is in housing, so again, it's the fair housing laws, not the ADA. And finally, did you include a date for expected response? And again, we'd recommend including a specific date, like May 3rd. That's about 2 weeks from when they receive the letter or email. So now that we've drafted our own letter, we'll see if we also need a supporting letter from our medical provider. So when do you need verification by a medical provider? A housing provider can ask for a letter of support from your medical provider if the disability and disability-related need are not obvious or apparent. For example, if Morgan is requesting a closer parking space due to a lung condition, that may not be something the housing provider can see from looking at Morgan. You do not need a letter of support if the disability-related need is obvious. So for instance, if there's a resident who is deaf and they ask for a fire alarm, you don't need any support for that. If you have already provided a letter of support recently that speaks to the same disability and functional limitations, then the housing provider is already aware of the disability-related needs, so they don't need an additional letter. Or if you have other official verification of your need, this most often comes up with people who have a disability plate or placard. These are often called HP plates and placards. These could be used instead of a medical letter of support if you're asking for a closer parking space. MCB also issues certificates of legal blindness, so that's another example, though in many cases, blindness is an apparent disability, so the verification wouldn't be necessary. Do note that a letter that verifies that you receive Social Security benefits cannot be used in place of the medical provider's letter of support because Social Security benefits do not speak to your symptoms or limitations. So who should write this letter if you need it? The medical provider can be a doctor, a nurse practitioner, even a clinical social worker, but it should be someone who you have a medical provider-patient relationship with, meaning that they actually see you for your conditions. It's best if the provider you choose is involved in your continuing care, and it's often most helpful if you choose a provider who works with a condition related to the accommodation you're asking for. So for instance, choosing a specialist like a pulmonologist instead of going to a primary care physician. But note that you only need one medical provider letter, even if you see multiple providers for the same condition. So what to include in your request? You only need one medical provider's letter because the purpose of their letter is simply to verify that you have the limitations you said you do and to support that the accommodation you requested makes sense with your limitations. The letter of support is going to be very similar to your own letter. It should explain that in their professional opinion, you meet the definition of having a disability. They also do not have to disclose your medical diagnosis if you don't feel comfortable with them doing so. It's helpful if they explain their relationship to you, like how long they've worked with you or that they're part of your continuing care team. It's helpful if they explain your functional limitations. and they should speak to the type of accommodation requested. Do note that they are not prescribing the accommodation and they are not saying that the RA is reasonable because that's a decision for your housing provider. They can say something like this type of accommodation generally supports the limitations that they have, or that they've seen improvement in your conditions with use of this accommodation in the past. So we have a couple tips for you in working with your medical provider to get a helpful letter on the first try. So one thing that's very helpful is to show them your accommodation or modification request letter, to explain the purpose of their letter in this process, to talk with your provider about what language you're comfortable using to describe your disability. And a final note on medical provider letters. Most often, if you're getting pushback from a housing provider, their concern is if the request is reasonable or is going to work in the housing setting. So providing additional letters of support from a medical provider doesn't respond to that concern. Only get additional letters of medical support if your housing provider says it's the medical letter that's the problem, that's the holdup in the situation. So if they do say that it's the medical provider's letter, be sure to ask your housing provider what information is missing so you can inform your medical provider and get an effective letter the second time around. So let's go back to our Tia example. If we assume that Tia does not have a disabled plate or placard, she would need a medical letter of support because she's making her request due to a lung condition and she hasn't indicated that she uses oxygen or anything that would make her lung condition obvious to her housing provider. So we'll look at an example of what her medical provider letter might look like. It'll probably look like something like this. I'm writing on behalf of my patient, Tia Mann. Tia meets the definition of a person with a disability. I have been Tia's pulmonologist for 4 years, and I continue to be a part of her care team. I'm writing in support of Tia's reasonable accommodation request for access to a closer parking space. Tia has a lung condition that decreases the amount of oxygen she is able to take in. This causes her shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, and increased fatigue. Paired with her joint conditions, which especially impact the joints in her knees and cause limited mobility of her knees, and shooting pains in her legs, she cannot walk more than about 50 feet without stopping to rest. Tia had an assigned parking space close to her unit at her last apartment, and I saw improvement in her conditions when she was given that closer space. So in my professional opinion, a closer parking space would prevent flare-ups in her conditions. And you can note here that the top of the letter has the doctor's official letterhead. The letter is dated and signed. So with the draft of both your own letter and your medical provider's letter of support in tow, I'll pass it back to Suzanne to talk about submitting your request.
So here's the big moment you've been waiting for. You can finally submit your request. This should be pretty straightforward. You just need to know who to send it to, and if your housing provider asks you to use their forms, you might be fitting your request into those. Depending on your housing situation, you could be submitting your request to your landlord, your property manager, or maybe a condo board. If you're not sure who to send it to, just ask. Remember to check you've put a requested response date so the timing expectations are clear, and make sure you keep a copy before you send it. Then you can put a reminder in your calendar for when to follow up and sit back and wait. What's next? People often think the next step is getting the decision, but there's actually an important step that happens first, the interactive process. It's best practice for the housing provider to engage with you and go back and forth if needed to try to work out an effective solution for you. So what might this look like? Your housing provider might be asking for some clarification. They might not understand your need or what exactly you're asking for. You might offer to show them the issue in person. This can be very effective at helping them understand the obstacles you're facing. They may come back to you offering a different solution from what you requested. Note that they don't have to give you exactly what you asked for as long as what they offer is at least as effective. So they might offer an easier, cheaper alternative, and then the ball's in your court. It can be helpful to try to be open-minded about their idea and think it through, or try it out to see if it could work adequately for you. Don't be thrown if they suggest something that seems like a terrible solution. Focus on using it as an opportunity to clarify your obstacle and what would make a solution effective for you. If you're clear that their solution won't be effective, it's important to explain why. For example, I can only lift my foot 3 inches, and the garage you've suggested I use has a 5-inch step. Sometimes a housing provider simply doesn't reply to your request at all. Legally, they do need to respond within a reasonable amount of time, or they end up effectively denying your request. But there isn't a defined time frame for a response. That's why it was so useful to put a requested response date in your letter. Then if you don't hear back from them by that date, you're going to want to follow up at least once or twice before assuming they aren't going to respond. We usually suggest giving the housing provider at least 2 weeks to consider your request and come back with any questions, more if they will need to get quotes or look at equipment. Recognize that it may also take time to put the solution into place, particularly with modifications where they might need to get quotes from contractors or wait for suitable weather for outdoor work. So once you've agreed a solution, it's a good idea to ask about timeframes for the implementation. Again, so it's comfortable to follow up if nothing seems to be happening. Let's look at some interactive process examples, and you can type in chat suggestions for how we could respond. Example 1. Say we send a reasonable modification request and the housing provider never responds. Type in the chat what your ideas are for what we could do. Anybody? Yeah, so you're going to follow up. You might want to remind them of your requested response date and offer to answer any questions that they may have. Example 2. We sent a request and the housing provider responds simply no. Type in the chat your ideas for what you could do to respond to that, how to handle it. Yeah, so the really important bit is to ask why. So that you can work out where the sticking point is. And ideally ask them to give their reason in writing so that you have a clear record. It's also often a good idea to review your request to see whether it provides all the information they need. In particular, are you properly explaining why this accommodation is needed because of your functional limitations? If you're not sure, this can be a good time to reach out to MOD or another neutral third party to talk over the situation. Example 3. We sent a request and the housing provider responds, I need your doctor's phone number so I can ask them some questions. But if this doesn't feel comfortable, how might you respond to that? Yeah, so you could offer to pass on any questions to your doctor, but ask that those questions go through you. Or you could simply ask what their questions are to see if there are things that you can adequately address yourself. And you can let your doctor know what you're happy with them sharing, what kind of wording you're comfortable with about your disability, and so on. So example number 4, we sent a request and the housing provider responds, I've never gotten a request like this before. I don't think I have to do this. What might we do? Yeah, so you might point them to their legal obligations. This is another situation where you can make use of MOD. You could send them our online guidance or point them to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification guidance, which we provide links to on our website, and letting them know that they can call us with their questions. We do our best to provide neutral and confidential answers to anybody who calls us. So those show how there can be a bit of back and forth during the interactive process, but at some point you're going to get a final decision from your housing provider, and Naomi's going to talk you through that step. Hang on a sec.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about the decision. So once you get the decision, or before you've gotten the decision, you've done all this work. You've explained your needs well, and you get this decision, which obviously can go in a few different ways. And one decision could be that the request is approved, which is obviously the best case scenario. And if that's the decision, the next step would be to implement the request, and it will hopefully resolve the issue and allow the person to equally enjoy their housing. Another potential decision could be, though, that the housing provider offers you an alternative accommodation to what you requested, maintaining that the alternative will be effective to address the barrier that you said you're experiencing in your housing. And a few moments ago, Suzanne talked about this, recommending that if an alternative accommodation is offered, it may be worth giving the alternative a try if you can, even if only to demonstrate in the end that it isn't effective, and explain the disability related reason why, because that would be important as well. The third potential option for a decision is the bad news, and that would be if the housing provider denies the request. And we all remember that housing providers are permitted to deny a request or consider it to be unreasonable under certain circumstances. And they're listed here once again. I guess I will read them again. And I hope you're okay with that. Undue financial or administrative burden, fundamental alteration of the business, direct threat to the health and safety of others, technical infeasibility, or there isn't enough information to suggest that it's needed. Now, we all know that just because a housing provider has offered one of these reasons, it's a fundamental alteration, it's not feasible or whatever, it doesn't mean that you agree with their analysis. But you do really need to consider the reasons to help you figure out whether you're in a position to successfully challenge the decision that they've made. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do you do if you're denied? And the first thing to really do is to evaluate the decision. We just talked about this. Did the housing provider even tell you why they denied the request? If they did, does their cited reason fall into one of those categories listed on the previous slide that we mentioned all along? If they offered one of these reasons as an excuse for not doing it, do you agree with it? And more importantly, do you have knowledge to dispute this assertion? Or do you think you need to know more in order to properly evaluate it? And do you know where to get that information? Do they seem confused about what you're asking for? We've talked a lot about describing limitations. but also, is it clear to them why your limitations are affecting you a particular way in housing? You know, what about the parking? What about you using this door handle doesn't work? What is the connection? I mean, sometimes that's not clear, and a lot of times, you know, we forget to be really clear with people because, you know, it's hard for all of us to think, you know, we all think that people understand our needs, and sometimes we don't do the best job explaining it the first time, you know. Um, Maybe they didn't even offer an explanation, so you can't properly evaluate it without more information. So you're really thinking about this decision because you're thinking about your next steps, your next course of action. Do you have one? And if you think that the reason for the denial can't be disputed, you would probably accept the decision and let it go. I mean, of course, you might need to do some research to figure it out, particularly if someone says, you know, there's this other law in the way that's preventing me from doing this. I can't, we can't build a ramp here because we can't build it according to code. You might need to figure out whether that's true and figure out who to go to get that information. And again, MOD might be a resource for those kinds of things to kind of help you evaluate your situation. But if you want to pursue the matter further because you think that you can challenge it, you would be considering whether you want to reach back out and just try to re-engage with them to see if offering further explanation or clarification will cause them to reconsider. In the case of not knowing why the request was denied, maybe there's another reason to reach back out and ask. Or maybe you feel like they're very firm on their decision and there isn't anything left for you to say because you've been going back and forth multiple times and you just want to take a more formal approach and file an administrative discrimination complaint. Um, so before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit more about the informal resolution and when it can be a useful approach. And again, by informal resolution, we're referring to reaching back out to the housing provider to see if there's still some room to negotiate with them, get them to reconsider and resolve the issue. Is there anything left to say? Did I do a great job explaining everything the first time? Am I certain that the housing provider isn't confused about what I'm asking for and why I need it? Do they misunderstand or have misinterpreted a rule or law that I can speak to? Just as an example, we found that a lot of private landlords are only familiar with the Federal Fair Housing Act. So if I receive a decision on my reasonable modification from a private landlord and they say, well, you can make this reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification at your own expense, you can do it, but you'll have to pay for it. And I live in a large private housing development. Perhaps that's a reason to reach out again and say, you know, I know you said that you're not responsible for this, but maybe you're just looking at the Federal Fair Housing Act. There is potential in the state law for you to have to finance this for me. So those are just some things to think about. You know, if it is worthwhile to go back to your housing provider and give it another try, you should really consider it. So if you are deciding to reach out and try to re-engage again, we're recommending that you do so in writing, just like you did before, to make sure you date the request and ask for a response by a particular date so that they know you're still looking into this and you're going to come back and say, what's your decision now? And then you can better gauge where you stand and what to do next. Now, you might think, and you know, I saw some of the comments in the chat, you might think it would make sense to immediately file a discrimination complaint when you disagree with a decision. You can do that. You have the right to do so, but you need to keep in mind what's involved in filing a complaint with an enforcement agency, what you'll have to do and what kind of time it will take and what they will do. Complaints do take a long time and they involve work on your part. You'll have to answer questions, submit and review documentation. The enforcement agencies at which you would be filing are neutral. They aren't reaching out to your housing provider to reprimand them for not accommodating you. They're investigating. Since filing a complaint isn't going to resolve an issue in real time, you should know that if it is successful, it's going to be months down the line. And for that reason, again, it's sensible to consider whether you're really at an impasse with your housing provider, and if it is worth reaching out in writing one more time to just request that they reconsider, because it may offer a possibility for resolution. Now, if you do this instead of immediately filing a complaint, it's only going to delay you by a couple of weeks because you're giving them a little bit of time to respond. And if they say no, okay, there might be a chance that they'll reconsider. And maybe, in some cases, maybe you went to the manager, but they report to the corporate office or to, and if you send a request again, or you ask them to reconsider and provide more clarification, that they're going to share it with another decision maker who might have, a different take on it. So if it doesn't work out, at least you're in a place where you've clarified all the facts. You're sure that you have, because you've gone back and forth and added additional clarification because after reviewing what you already sent, and you've only lost a couple of weeks. And then you have further documentation to share in support of your complaint. Okay, next slide, please. So on this slide, we've listed some resources for getting information about other housing related topics because they do come up a lot. We find that many people who have tenants' rights related issues immediately seek out information about housing rights for people with disabilities, even though their issue falls into the category of a tenants' rights issue. So two state agencies, the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation and the Office of the Attorney General, provide general information about tenants' rights laws, as do the local legal aid agencies. And you can get also information on their respective websites. The boards of health and inspectional services in cities and towns have oversight of health and sanitation issues in housing. Building inspectors in cities and towns are the local enforcement of the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board regulations. As we mentioned before, the Architectural Access Board of Massachusetts develops and enforces building code that is designed to make the built environment accessible to people with disabilities and safe and functional for people with disabilities. And finally, MOD's Community Service Unit provides a lot of information and guidance on architectural access issues and has familiarity with MAB regulations, the ADA standards, and other access-related codes. Next slide, please. So here are the two enforcement agencies at which people can file an administrative discrimination complaint if they believe their housing provider has denied a request that's reasonable. And they are the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination on the state side and the HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity on the federal side. Obviously, MCAD enforces the state version of the law, the Chapter 151B, and HUD enforces the Federal Fair Housing Act. And as we've mentioned, the two laws offer similar protection, but differ in a few areas. And, there's some links on that slide as well. So MCAD and HUD handle their complaint processes slightly differently, but in both cases, they're conducting an investigation from a neutral position to determine whether the law that they oversee was violated. It's really important to keep in mind that these agencies are not advocates for the person who filed a complaint. They're neutral. They're asking both sides for their version of events, what happened from their perspectives. Both sides are going to be asked to submit information about their positions on this issue and answer questions. So at the very least, you should expect the initial investigation to take 3 to 4 months, and that's just the amount of time it will take to get the decision. And the decision is that there is either enough or isn't enough evidence to suggest that discrimination may have occurred. So it's like a preliminary decision. And from there, the next steps could include settling the case, or going to a public hearing or court. And there is also the possibility that from the decision that they find that there isn't enough evidence for them to have determined that discrimination may have occurred. And in that case, there are steps you can take to appeal that decision. Okay, so if you're filing a complaint, you would have to choose at which enforcement agency to file. You can look at their websites to help you make a decision. If you would file at one or the other, you wouldn't file at both, although I believe Mass Commission Against Discrimination, MCAD, has a contract with HUD to investigate cases. So you might find that if you file at MCAD, that it's also filed at HUD. And sometimes HUD, if you file at HUD, they'll refer the case to MCAD or for investigation. And sometimes a case will be referred to like a local city human rights commissions who also have jurisdiction to sometimes investigate discrimination complaints. But wherever you file, before you file, you should just prepare, read about the investigative process so you know what to expect and what you'll be asked to do. I think it's probably very helpful to prepare a factual timeline so you're prepared to answer questions from the investigator and that you can submit information in a logical, chronological way. Because if you're an investigator and you are receiving many, many complaints, you want to have a clear idea of what the different sides version of events are. And if you prepare a chronological timeline beforehand for yourself, you can keep your information organized so that the reader of your information has a clear understanding of your version of events. Gather all your supporting documentation, again, at the beginning before you file. Okay, so there are a few situations where you would not file a housing discrimination complaint at HUD, and you probably recall from earlier that the Federal Fair Housing Act, which HUD enforces, does not require private landlords to cover the cost of reasonable modifications, and the state law does if there are more than 10 units, if it is a reasonable request. So this means that if you live in private housing and you're disputing whether a landlord should pay for a reasonable modification, you've been denied, you would file a complaint at MCAD rather than HUD in that particular instance. Otherwise, it's more of a choice of yours. The second instance in which you wouldn't go to HUD would be if you live in a 3-unit or 4-unit owner-occupied building, and this is because the Federal Fair Housing Act, which HUD enforces, does not cover these types of housing. The state law, which is enforced by MCAD, Chapter 151B, covers everything other than the 2-unit owner-occupied housing. Okay, so how can we help at MOD? We provide information and technical guidance. We are not caseworkers. We answer questions. We may have more than one conversation, but our role is to kind of help people understand their situation, or understand the laws, and based on the context of their situation, and kind of troubleshoot things from there. We might provide draft or help review reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification requests. We can provide practical suggestions before reaching the complaint stage. So we don't assist people in filing complaints. We do not have the authority to contact a housing provider to tell them to take a particular action or stop taking a particular action. We'll talk to a person who is in need of an accommodation, a family member. We'll talk to a housing provider. So one thing you could do is, if you were having difficulty or you felt that a housing provider had no understanding of their obligations, you're certainly free to give them our contact information or forward our guidance documentation to them. Once you get to an impasse with your housing provider and you decide to file a complaint, we aren't going to provide further guidance from there, but we are going to try and put you in a good position to put forth the best request that you can. Next slide, please. And I really encourage and direct you to our website. because we have a lot of helpful guidance on disability rights. It's an ever expanding page. But a really good page, sorry to put in a plug for ourselves, is our reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification and housing page, which will highlight many of the things we discussed today. I realize we've gone through, a lot of material that's dense and pretty quickly. And this is also going to be recorded, so it will eventually be on our website. If you would ever like to consult with us, please feel free to submit a question online via our website or at this friendly URL. You can also contact us at our phone number, but note that we're a very small staff, so we have an answering system. We will always get back to people, but you will leave a message and be put in a queue.